I love making bookmarks, watercolour bookmarks, because they make great little presents and they let you just try out new techniques in a really low pressure environment, because after all, if something goes wrong, you've only lost a piece of paper that size. These bookmarks, you don't even need to be able to paint, because I'm using a stencil and some modelling paste to create a texture and then adding some paint on top to really bring it to life. My name's Liz Chaderton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire. Every week I bring a tip, trick or technique that I wish I'd known about ages ago. And this week it is my love of watercolour bookmarks and creating texture using modelling paste and a stencil.
First, you need your watercolour paper. You can get these bookmark pads, so they're already cut for you from Hannah, or of course you can just cut up a piece of paper, and these dimensions are pretty good, so 5.5 by 20 centimetres or 2 and a bit by 8 inches. The only reason that I say that these are really nice is 100% cotton paper, and it's just convenience. You need some modelling paste, you will need a stencil, something to scrape the modelling paste through, an old credit card or a palette knife, and then when it's dry we'll need some watercolours. And to give you an idea of the process, we're going to make the pattern with modelling paste on our paper, and then once it's dry we can paint on top of it and let the paint pool in that gorgeous texture. I have taped down and covered the edges with masking tape, and I have selected this stencil which just about fits, which is rather nice. I think you should choose a stencil that hasn't got too big a pattern, because these are very small bits of paper, so one that's appropriate to the size. So I reckon that would be nice with the flowers. Something a bit more abstract might be quite nice. If I put it against the blue you'll see it pretty well, and I think that would make rather nice swirly whirly pattern. Or it's a bookmark, whoever's receiving it probably likes letters and words, so you could put on some letters if you've got something like this. Modelling paste, again, this happens to be from the range, but something like Galleria from Winsor & Newton is really nice. It doesn't matter what the modelling paste is, as long as it's white. You could even use gesso if that's what you've got, though because it is more liquid you'll get a softer effect. You use it usually in your acrylic painting to make your paints thicker to get really textured effects. It dries flexible and it dries waterproof. So I'm positioning my stencil in the area I want. I think it'd be nice to have the big flowers here and the little ones there. I'm putting a lump of modelling paste on there and I am scraping it through my stencil. Gotta make sure it's through all over the place. Don't want excess because this is going in a book, so we want to keep it pretty thin. When I'm happy with that little scrape, I just lift it out of the way and I've got this wonderful texture on my bookmark. Now I need to leave that to dry. Don't need to worry about the bits that are on the tape, because those will just peel off. And when I've finished with this, I do need to clean it before it dries, because this dries waterproof and will gum up my stencil. Once I'm happy, I put my little lump of modelling paste down and just hold it in place and gently scrape it through, and then take that off and I've got that lovely pattern. Now, of course, as you do this, you need to be really careful you don't smudge what you've done already, especially because I've taped these all close to each other. And there I've got my letters. And gently lifting that up. And now we need to put this somewhere safe where it will not get smudged, and let it dry. You can use a hairdryer if you want to speed up that process. Only danger of doing that is that it may lift your masking tape.
So all this modelling paste is totally dry. I left it overnight. Usually, because it's such a thin layer, it would be dry within maybe an hour. Now, this is a great exercise in using up any leftover paint. All we do now is go with our watercolour over the top of our texture and use plenty of water. And can you see how it flows into the valleys? Isn't that gorgeous? You will find different brands of modelling paste are more or less absorbent. So some, like this one, seems to repel the watercolour a lot. Some will absorb. So it shows up that texture just beautifully, but we're not going to stop there. We're going to start mixing colours on the surface. So I'm dropping in some Quin Gold there. That was Quin Red, the pink that I used. And now I can drop in some Quin Gold. And again, I think the more water you use, the more of a nice flow you get. What you can also do, let's choose a different colour. I've got very dark. Do you think that's probably indigo, I would imagine? So I'm use this to totally clean up palettes. And you can deliberately and more carefully drop it into the valleys like that. So none goes on the raised areas. Looking at this paper, I think it was one that I just cut from a scrap. So it isn't from that Hannah Muller pad. And it isn't behaving very nicely, which makes me suspicious. I did have a really nasty batch of watercolour paper that I bought. And I wondered why it was so cheap. I bought it from a very reputable source, but I wondered why it was so cheap, and it's because it was horrible. It was years ago, and I've been using it up ever since in little projects where it doesn't matter. I could not paint a proper picture on it at all. But even here, it's not behaving quite as I would like. Too much, or you want more of the pattern to show through, of course, just use your kitchen towel to control the amount of that water. Let's come on to the letters one, and again, just to show what it looks like with a simple wash over it. And how strong you do these colours, or how dilute. Again, you could go for a far more subtle effect. You could make them really bright. You could deliberately tone down by painting over the raised areas so that they get a glaze like this. Just, fiddle around until you're happy, really. Whoa, that is a green. But just a wash on its own is super effective. Find a blue in another of these dirty palettes. You're now seeing just how many dirty palettes I've got. Lots and lots and lots. So dropping in some phthalo blue, which is mixing to make a very strong turquoisey green. We should end up with some nice purpley mixes. Now, I've used this sort of background in finished paintings with great effect. I think it's absolutely lovely. And I've either done it all over, an abstract pattern all over, and then painted on top, or I've painted the subject first and then used this as a background around it for an abstract background. So though we are practicing here, you can use it in sort of mixed media watercolour, this sort of effect, Right, we'll let those dry and then we'll peel off and we'll take it from there. So now we have the fun of carefully, and I do mean carefully, removing the tape. If it sticks, use a hairdryer just to warm the gum and it'll remove a bit more easily.
If you have any seepage under the tape, or the edge has got scuffed up by the tape, you've got a couple of options. You could grab an acrylic marker and just disguise it. It might take a couple of layers depending how opaque your marker is. You could use a little bit of gouache, or this has just occurred to me and I've never done this before, but hey, that's the whole point of doing these things. You could actually paint the edge, but I've got this acrylic marker. Rather than having that clean white edge, should you have the right colour, you could do a different edge to it. Never done this before. Not entirely sure I like this. But what I was saying about bookmarks, you know, they're just a good way of experimenting, because if I don't like it, what have I lost? 5 by 20 piece of watercolour paper. It's not a lot, is it? When you're happy, then I like to round off the corners, and I've got a little punch. You can just buy these online. You do not have to do the rounding off if you have not got a punch like this. Really doesn't matter one iota. So with these all being dry, what we need to do is seal them, because this is watercolour and it would, if they get wet, the colour will come off and that could potentially go on your book, and that is not good. And what I'm using is wax. It's actually furniture wax. It's clear and it's designed to go over chalk paint. You can use Dorland's wax, which is an art wax medium, but given that these are bookmarks, you know, they are not pieces of art that are going to go in a museum, are they? I don't think it's particularly worth the expense of using Dorland's. What I like about waxing is it gives a lovely sheen to the piece, as well as sealing it. You just rub the wax on a very thin layer, and then when it's cured, which takes about an hour so it feels dry, take a soft cloth and you just rub it over and you get a little sheen to it. It also, just if you've scuffed the edges of your paper, it settles the fibres down again. Your watercolour will not move in that wax because watercolour is water soluble and there is no water in the wax. If you do not like the feel of the wax on your hands, or you will have eczema or any sort of dry skin like that, it is sensible to use a cloth to put this on. Put it on both sides of the paper. I used, I think maybe I mentioned earlier in the film, I was using up some really nasty watercolour paper to do this. I wasn't using that nice Hannah Muller stuff, and because I thought, oh, I'm putting modelling paste on, that won't matter. Do you know, I really regret that decision, and I'm going to make some more of these on decent paper because they've slightly cockled. I think they will flatten out, and I've even got a bit of the colour showing through. I've never had that happen before. I just wondered, you can see some of the colours come through. It was such nasty watercolour paper, and I really should have just thrown it away, but I thought, oh, I can use it for a project like this. So let my mistake be your guide. It is worth using, maybe not your bestest, though you may have some scraps and bits cut off something, so you could some decent paper, but don't use really poor watercolour paper for this, because bad watercolour paper is just bad. You can do all sorts with bad watercolour paint, but bad watercolour paper is a horror. If you haven't got this wax or don't want to use it, you could just use a bit of varnish. And I think matte varnish would be nice because it keeps it looking like a watercolour. If you put shiny varnish on, it ends up looking like acrylic. You can get little sleeves to put bookmarks in if you want to. So you could do that. I think it'd be a shame to laminate these because of course we've got texture and you won't feel the texture through lamination. And this wax isn't expensive. A pot like that would last for so long and wax about 3 million bookmarks. We'll let those cure for about an hour and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to buff them, punch a little hole, find a nice tassel. With the wax dry on these, it's just a case of taking a lint-free cloth and buffing them, and there's no secret to buffing. It just is a few firm wipes, just as if you were buffing wax furniture, and don't forget to do both sides. The next thing to do, I mean on these we just need to work out which way up we want them. I think probably that way for this one. Mark where you want the hole. This is if you are going to do tassels. If you don't like tassels or don't have tassels, don't worry about it. Just punch a hole. But you can buy these sorts of tassels online for just a few pence each, and I'll put a link to those. Choose one that you like the colour combination of. Can go for a contrast, that's rather nice actually, or green. I'll probably use the green because that's quite a tricky colour to use and that'll use it up better. And then it's a case of putting the loop through, pulling the tassel through that loop, making sure all the bits are through, and you're finished. Bookmark. This one that I wasn't very fond of, it's actually growing on me slightly because that's a wider border up here. I'm going to put the hole in the middle of the border on this. There we go, number 2. If when you come to buff it still feels a little bit sticky, then just wait a bit longer. It should just take a couple of rubs to bring up a little sheen on it. Prefer slightly darker. There you go. For textured watercolour bookmarks, where we have learnt about applying that texture through the stencil and adding the washes and deepening the valleys. If you've enjoyed that, I've got lots of other bookmark ideas on YouTube. You might like these floral ones with a nice wet in wet technique. You might like these landscape ones where we use masking fluid and practice that. You might like these line and wash landscapes. This one line and wash and this one's got a bit of collage on it. Or enjoy these ones which are reverse stenciling. So practicing really interesting texture background. This has lots of salt in it. This had cling film. This had granulation. And then lifting the paint through a stencil to create the final effect. I hope you get as addicted as I am to bookmarks and find it a really good way of practicing and doing rather posh swatching.